Good evening and welcome everyone uh, to the public consultation webinar for the Sea Stacks Offshore Wind project being hosted by ESB. My name is Conor Martin and I'll be acting as the MC for the event. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all here tonight and thank you for your interest in the project and for taking the time to join us here this evening. Before we get going, just a couple of housekeeping items to make everyone aware of. So for questions during the webinar, we're using the Menti platform. So to submit a question, go to the menti.com website and input the 8-digit code shown on screen, highlighted in the yellow bubble. And we'd welcome all questions, comments and feedback on the webinar details or indeed on the project in general. The project website and email address are also available for getting in touch and providing feedback at any time. And these details will be shown at the base of every slide throughout the webinar. And secondly, the session is being recorded so that it can be made available and uploaded to the project website in due course for anyone who isn't available to join the live event this evening. Now, this webinar is being delivered as part of our ongoing public consultations and community and stakeholder engagement for the project. And it's our first public event, but it will be followed by future public exhibitions and in-person events. So we've allowed an hour for the webinar, starting with some presentations from key members of the project team. So first up, Lee Murphy, as the project director, will provide some introduction and background into the Sea Stacks project. We'll then move to a technical overview from Ailish Martin, our grid specialist, and David Keane, the offshore wind technical manager. Emma Delaney, our environmental and consenting specialist, will then provide an overview of some of the environmental aspects of the project. And finally, Brian Haggerty, the offshore wind stakeholder manager, will talk through some of the community and stakeholder engagement details for the project. We'll then go to Q&A. And just a reminder once again that we're using the Menti platform for questions during the webinar. And these can be submitted through the menti.com website using the 8-digit code shown at the base of the screen. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over now to Lee Murphy for the project introduction and background.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Lee Murphy, and as Conor said, I work as project director for Sea Stacks Offshore Wind Farm. I've worked for ESB for about 13 years now. My main qualification is in town planning, and I've spent most of my career developing renewable energy projects, mostly onshore and offshore wind across Ireland and the UK. So as Conor said, this is our first dedicated public consultation event for the project. We're at a very early stage of the development process, and look, there will be many more engagement events as the project progresses. We wanted to reach out to as broad an audience as possible in the first instance, and therefore we felt the best way to communicate was through this public webinar forum, but there will be face-to-face information events held into the future. Given how early we're at in the development process, we won't be in a position to answer all of your questions this evening. However, we felt it was important to hold the event at this time to give everyone an insight into the current status and our thinking in relation to the overall project. This is just a starting point, but we do want to hear your feedback at this stage, as we want to take your views into consideration as we develop the project design and layout. Some of you may be aware that our application for a foreshore license is currently under consultation, and there is an opportunity to provide feedback on the application before the 9th of August. So maybe just a little bit about ESB. ESB is the leading Irish utility business. It's 96% owned by the state, and it operates across both Ireland and the UK. The ESB group is composed of 3 separate companies. ESB Networks manages the construction and maintenance of the electricity transmission system in the Republic of Ireland. The equivalent system in Northern Ireland, NIE, is also owned by ESB. Electric Ireland supplies electricity and gas to business and residential customers in Ireland. And then ESB Generation and Trading operates a portfolio of thermal renewable assets. The Sea Stacks project is a GT development. In total then, the company has over 7,800 employees, and in 2021 it invested over €1 billion in company infrastructure, made a contribution of over €2 billion to the Irish economy, and contributed over 2.5 million to community initiatives. We also launched a new strategy this year, Net Zero. So ESB is taking urgent and focused action to achieve net zero emissions by 2040 and putting in place the infrastructure and services to enable our customers and broader society to live more sustainably. From a generation perspective, that means a five-fold increase in renewable electricity, increasing our renewable generation portfolio from about 1 gigawatt today to 5 gigawatts, and reducing the carbon intensity of our generation by 2/3 by 2030. Climate change is real. Warmer temperatures over time are changing weather patterns and disrupting the usual balance of nature. This poses many new risks to human beings and all other forms of life on Earth. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change issued a new report this year. The scientific evidence is absolutely unequivocal. Climate change is a threat to human well-being and the health of the planet. Any further delay in concerted global action will miss a brief and rapidly closing window to secure a livable future. This week also, we've seen record-breaking temperatures in the UK and across parts of mainland Europe. Scientists at this stage agree that without steep cuts to the greenhouse gases causing climate change, heat waves, wildfires, flooding and drought will significantly worsen. The response of the Irish government to this threat is covered under a number of policy documents, including the Climate Action Plan 2021. This sets out a new target. 80% of all electricity generated by 2030 must come from renewable sources. The development of onshore wind has been a great success story in Ireland over the last 25 years, and while many new projects will be built in the next decade, there is a limit to the amount of suitable land for this technology. This year also, we have seen the first large-scale solar projects come onto the system, and it is envisaged that they will contribute up to 2.5 gigawatts of electricity to the national target. However, offshore wind is the main element of that decarbonisation process, with at least 5 gigawatts of operational projects targeted by 2030. It's not just about decarbonisation, though. The deployment of offshore wind enables greater levels of energy independence for Ireland through the reduction in imported fossil fuels such as gas. This is absolutely key, given that security of supply is severely threatened by the ongoing war in the Ukraine. ESB has always been a pioneer in energy innovation since its establishment in the 1920s. Ardnacrusha, a hydroelectric power station on the Shannon, was commissioned not long after the foundation of the Irish state. Into the 1950s, peat-fired power stations were developed right across the Midlands and beyond. Moneypoint Power Station was constructed in the 1980s. Following the energy crisis of the 70s, there was a significant move away from imported oil. And then in the early part of this century, ESB was at the forefront of new offshore wind development with projects like Carnsore and Wexford. In this decade then, ESB has commissioned one of the largest onshore wind farms in Ireland, Grousemount in County Kerry. We've also commenced construction on the Neartnagui offshore wind project in Scotland. In ESB, we have always embraced new challenges, and that will continue into the future. So a little bit about the Sea Stacks project. The project name is derived from the iconic Poolbeg chimneys, one of the most readily identifiable landmarks on the Dublin landscape. The stacks are associated with Poolbeg Generating Station, which was constructed in the early 1970s, and are really a monument to an era of fossil fuel burning. In identifying the Sea Stack site, we considered a range of both environmental and technical factors, including water depth, shipping and navigation issues, and proximity to areas of greatest electricity demand. We also considered the various stakeholders and marine users who could potentially be impacted by both the site investigation works and the ultimate development of the wind farm. Emma will discuss later in this presentation in more detail around our thinking here. At a high level, the project will be located approximately 12 kilometers from shore to the nearest point. It will have a capacity ranging from 600 to 800 megawatts, equating to anywhere between 40 and 55 turbines. It will also produce enough electricity every year to power approximately 750,000 homes. So this slide just shows the key project milestones at a high level. We plan to make an application for and receive a maritime area consent, which is effectively a seabed lease next year. We expect to make a planning application to onboard Planola at the end of 2024. And then in 2025, we are expecting the Offshore Renewable Energy Support Scheme to launch. This is a competitive auction process where applicants bid a unit price for a certain amount of capacity. The lowest bidders are guaranteed this price for a period of up to 16.5 years. While it's difficult to estimate the length of time it will take to secure planning permission, we believe it can be in place by the end of 2025. And once this is secured, we will enter into a grid connection agreement with EirGrid in 2026 and commence construction in 2027. With an approximate 2-year build program, we expect to commence operations in 2029. I'll hand you over to my colleague now, Eilish Martin, who will take a closer look at some of the more technical aspects of the project with a particular focus on the grid infrastructure.
Thanks, Liam. Good evening, everyone. My name is Eilish Martin, and I work in the role of grid specialist, and I'm responsible for leading the grid connection strategy of ESB's offshore portfolio. I'm an electrical engineer by background and have over 16 years experience in all grid aspects, working in commercial contracts for generation plant, transmission system planning and operation, and development of renewable policy, both from a technical standards viewpoint and also regulation. I welcome the opportunity to come here and talk to you today on some of the technical aspects of our Sea Stacks project. First of all, I will briefly describe the electrical infrastructure of our proposed offshore project here in Dublin Bay, and then I will talk through the proposed connection method and strategy. So as Liam indicated, we'll be installing 40 to 55 turbines within the development area to harness the wind energy and produce electricity. The wind turbine generators will be selected to suit the wind resource of the site. Each of the turbines are linked via an inter-array cable system. These cables will likely be at 66 kV. They will be laid and buried in a shallow depth on the seabed to protect the cables from marine activity. When this is not possible, we can install concrete mattresses or rock dumping to protect the cables. The purpose of the inter-array cables is to transmit the power generated by the turbines to the offshore substation. At the offshore substation, the power is collected from the inter-array cables. It is transformed from 66 kV up to 220 kV. The higher voltage minimizes losses along the cables. From here, the power is transmitted to the shore via two 220 kV offshore cables. And as Liam said, the site is approximately 12 kilometers from shore. The offshore cables will be laid in an optimized route and buried in a shallow depth. At the landfall point, the offshore cable and the onshore cable will be joined at a transition joint bay. The transition joint bay is an underground chamber constructed of reinforced concrete to provide a safe and secure environment for the cable joints. And then again, onshore, we will have two 220 kV export cables. These cables will be directly buried or in trenches, and the surface will be backfilled to how it was before installation. Further survey work and engagement with EirGrid, the asset owner, and the transmission system operator are required to finalise the route and connection point of the export cables. The project onshore cables will connect to the onshore substation. It is here that the wind farm meets the transmission system and is able to provide power to the demand in the Greater Dublin area. The onshore substation includes equipment which will harmonise and regulate the power produced by the turbines to align with TSO technical standards. It should also be pointed out here that all transmission assets, as shown here in this picture, will have to be built to transmission standards as advised by EirGrid. So a bit of history on ESB developing generation in the Dublin Bay area. In this picture, Ringsend and Poolbeg power stations are outlined in blue, with Ringsend on the western side and Poolbeg along the coast. ESB began generating electricity in 1955 in Ringsend and 1971 in Poolbeg. In 2000, ESB upgraded Poolbeg to a more efficient gas-fired plant, which has an overall capacity of 460 megawatts. In 2002, ESB commissioned Dublin Bay Power gas plant in Ringsend, And here the contracted output is 415 megawatts. So in total, ESB is 875 megawatts of contracted thermal generation in the area. ESB are proposing to connect Sea Stacks into Poolbeg. This is not only selected based on ESB's existing generation sites, but also informed by EirGrid's 2019 East Coast Generation Opportunity Analysis report, where Poolbeg to 20 kV station was highlighted as an optimal location for connection of offshore wind developments. Part of ESB's grid strategy for Sea Stacks is examining the option of connecting the offshore wind farm in parallel with our thermal plant and sharing the currently contracted 875 megawatts of grid capacity. In essence, what this means is that ESB will be responsible for ensuring that the combined output does not exceed the contracted capacity. So operationally, when wind is blowing, we limit the output of the thermal generation, and vice versa. When there's no wind, we can support the system by exporting thermal generation. By co-locating the generation, we believe that this will help smoothen the transition, enabling ESB's net zero ambition. Some of the key benefits of this hybrid connection is that it optimizes the use of existing transmission infrastructure, thereby reducing the requirement for additional onshore reinforcements, minimizing environmental and community impact. It also ensures the earliest connection date to help Ireland achieve its 5 gigawatt of offshore ambition by 2030. I'd like to thank you for your time today, and I will hand over to my colleague David, who will talk in more detail on the offshore engineering aspects of the project.
Thanks, Ailish. I'm having some technical difficulties today, but could somebody confirm they can hear me from Ailish or Connor?
Yeah, I can hear you, David. Thank you.
Great. Yeah. So apologies for the lack of background. So thank you everyone for joining. My name is David Keane and I'm the Offshore Wind Technical Manager for ESB. A key part of my role is coordinating the offshore engineering disciplines associated with the project. I'm a chartered civil engineer and I've been working in the offshore energy industry for around 10 years, working on a number of offshore wind projects around Europe before coming to ESB to focus on ESB's development portfolio. I have a further 5 years working on onshore infrastructure project development in Ireland. Over the next few slides, I'll be giving an overview of the offshore project activities for 3 general phases of the project. The short term, which is the development phase, the medium term, which is the construction and installation phase, and then the longer term operational phase of the project. So focusing on the short term, ESB are planning a series of surveys, engineering surveys within the project study area, which is shown on screen. So it's the black boundary of for the offshore cable corridor or back to shore, and then the wind turbine area of search. It's worth pointing out at this stage that this area will not be filled with turbines and export cables. It's an area that we're using surveys to try and find the optimal area to site this infrastructure. So the first surveys are as shown on screen. So this is the geophysical surveys. The vessel on the top left is a typical vessel that would be used to undertake these surveys. And these surveys are non-obtrusive in that they'll be towing a suite of survey equipment behind the vessel, which will get information relating to the seabed and subseabed conditions. The objectives of the survey are to understand the site stratigraphy in terms of the soil layering and accurately map geohazards such as shipwrecks or areas of challenging ground conditions or possibly unexploded ordnance. It's worth saying ESB originally anticipated undertaking these surveys in 2023, but with some recent industry developments, we may look to undertake these surveys further forward in the project schedule in 2022. This aspect is not decided yet, but we will continue to engage with stakeholders in this regard and keep people up to date when there is a final decision made in this regard. Following the geophysical surveys, geotechnical surveys will be undertaken. And again, a typical vessel that you might see in the offshore environments during this phase is shown on the bottom right. Information collected as part of this will be combined with the geophysical survey data to create a project ground model. And one of the key objectives with collecting intrusive data is to understand the engineering characteristics of the seabed conditions, which will inform foundation design and offshore cable installation methodologies. The next part of the offshore engineering survey phase is meteorological and oceanographic surveys. So these will collect information relating to the wind, wave, and tidal conditions on the site and again will help inform the project design envelope in terms of understanding loading conditions on structures. The image in the top right is a floating LiDAR, which will collect information relating to the wind speeds on the site, which is obviously critical to the project business case to understand the energy yield output associated with the project. The item in the bottom right is Wave Buoy, which will collect wave information, and a vessel will tow these to site where they'll be installed on the site for approximately 1 year. The next aspect I want to talk about is following surveys and completion of design activities. We'll progress the project to the various milestones, and the project will enter the construction and installation phase, which we'd anticipate will take 2 to 3 years. I'll provide an outline here of some key activities that will happen in the offshore environment during this time, and I'll use some examples from ESB's projects in the UK. The first aspect is foundations, which are shown on screen. On this example, there's a monopile foundation which is being loaded onto an installation vessel from a construction marshalling port. This is the preliminary preferred foundation type for the Sea Stacks project. So following fabrication, these would be transported to a local construction marshalling port for the project, and then an installation vessel, very similar to what's shown here, will transport the monopiles to the site where they'll be installed using pile driving technology. There is an alternative foundation type which may be used for the project, which is called the jacket structure, which is effectively a tubular steel frame, and it's connected to pre-installed pin piles that would be on the seabed, which would be installed in a similar manner to a monopile. The next aspect is subsea cables. So these would be installed by the vessels that are shown on screen here. And these are basically laid and buried by these sort of vessels, and they'd be installed by project specified equipment, such as a plough shown in the top left. Again, these would be informed by the information collected during the survey phase. The next aspect is the project offshore substation platform. And in this case here, we can see a jacket foundation in the top right. And this is from a project we're just building at the moment in Scotland. And the offshore substation topside, which is shown in the bottom left, this would be installed by a heavy lift vessel on top of the pre-installed jacket. It's this offshore piece of infrastructure where the project inter-array cables and the export cables will be connected. Most importantly for an offshore wind farm is the wind turbine generators themselves. So these are one of the last offshore installation aspects. And similar to the foundations, they'll be collected from a construction marshalling port, whereby a turbine installation vessel similar to as shown on the image from our Galloper project in the UK will collect the components and transport them to the field before being installed in a modular format. As you can see in the bottom left image, the tower is installed first. From there, the nacelle is installed on top of the tower, and then the rotor and the blades are then installed. Following this, commissioning activities will be undertaken before the project generation and transmission infrastructure is energized for exporting electricity back to the grid. The last, and I suppose the longest duration phase of the project is the operational phase. So for the Sea Stacks Offshore Wind project, ESB will be looking to operate it for between 25 and 30 years. And for that, we'll require a base for 24/7 management and operations of the wind farm. This base will include warehousing, office and welfare facilities for the staff working on the long-term aspects of the project. And it'll be our intention that this will be located in the Dublin or Wicklow area to ensure there's as short distance travel as possible for this crew transfer vessels to get to and from the site. So the crew transfer vessels will typically be at this location as well, and these will carry personnel and equipment and spares for both planned and unplanned maintenance throughout the life cycle of the project. I've shown here jobs that will be available during this phase of the project. So this is a key part of the project in terms of bringing jobs to the local community associated with the project. At the end of the operational life of the project, ESB will look to either repower or decommission the project facilities. Thank you to everyone in attendance, and I'll pass you over to Emma Delaney relating to the environmental and consenting aspects of the project. Thank you.
Great, thanks, David. My name is Emma Delaney. I have 19 years experience in environmental assessment and regulatory consenting, both on the onshore and offshore field. This evening, I'm just going to give you an overview of the environmental and consenting work that we've undertaken on the project to date, and also kind of give you an overview of what we're going to be doing in the future, and most importantly, how you can feed into that process as well. So there'll be public consultation ongoing for the entirety of the project, and then certain times when you can feed into the statutory process. So there, just in terms of the first work that we've been doing at a very initial stage, we've been undertaking site screening. And that really is in essence looking at the key environmental sensitive areas that we're aware of, such things as European sites and ecological habitats and fishing grounds and that sort of thing. And one of the key things really was mapping the known constraints, such as the map I have there just on the right hand side, just illustrating some of the SPAs and SACs, the European sites. And the process really is about ruling out and avoiding unsuitable areas from a very early stage and coming to and finding a site that avoids in the main ecologically and environmentally sensitive areas. From that process, really what has come about is key areas that we knew needed further assessment, so such things as fisheries, ecology and navigation. So we employed specialists in those areas to undertake further assessments for us and to identify other further constraints that we can avoid in terms of that site. So in terms of the next stage of the project, so we've kicked off long lead ecological surveys on the project, and that's, I suppose, on the basis of the importance of particularly ornithology and marine mammals in this area and off the east coast. So we kicked those off in November 2020. They'll be ongoing for at least 2 years. And as you can see, they're just on the right hand side, it's digital aerial surveys that are flown by expert consultants that we've employed at APEM, who are flying the site on a monthly basis on a transit basis and gathering information for us. So they're taking digital photographs for us, and that's providing information to the project in relation to the distribution and abundance of the seabirds and marine mammals in the area. So one of the key, this is some images there of some of the images that they've captured. So there's some kittiwake and harbour porpoise, which aligns with, I suppose, what we'd known initially in terms of the importance of those species with the European designated sites along the east coast there. So we've kicked those off. And then the next stage, we, as Liam has mentioned and David has given an overview of, we've applied for a foreshore license application. And that's just for the site investigation phase of the project. So that's just going out and doing the survey. So that's just the red line boundary there on the right hand side. So as David mentioned, that's just the extent of it. The project won't fill this area, but that's just the area we're looking at to optimize design. So these surveys really will give us a lot of baseline information that we can use in the next stage, which is the environmental impact assessment process. And that it's out for a second public consultation at the moment. So it's open till the 9th of August. So the foreshore license application can be accessed from the Department of Housing and Local Government's website, and the reference there is 7134. In terms of the next stage then, I suppose we've applied for the foreshore license, and the next stage really then is undertaking that EIA process and looking at really, taking all that the baseline information that we've gathered and from desktop surveys and studies and from surveys, and getting really, compiling the facts of that first stage of the process. We're looking at the existing environment and what's there. And then the second stage of the process really is about prediction of the likely effects. So, what has the potential for the project to impact upon, and there's lots of things to consider there in terms of everything from benthic habitats to navigation and shipping to cultural heritage and landscape and seascape. So they all need to be considered in the EIA process. So we'll be appointing specialist EIA consultants to do that work for us, and with specialists in each of those areas feeding into the process. So in terms of the next stage of public consultation, we'll be coming back out to yourselves to undertake that EIA scoping, and we'll be seeking input from yourselves in relation to that scoping. And we'll also be undertaking assessment in relation to the Habitats Directive as well. So I suppose it's all kind of leading towards a planning application, and that environmental impact assessment and the A documentation will be submitted to An Bord Pleanála, who are the competent authority to grant planning, and there'll be statutory consultation on that, so people can go when the application is lodged, they can see the documentation that we've submitted and make their submissions in relation to that or any concerns they may have. They will be evaluated then, so the competent authority will go through our documentation and evaluate, and it's up to the An Bord Pleanála then to decide whether or not the project should be permitted to proceed. And they take into consideration all the various aspects from the environment and climate and stakeholders and all those various things. So as I say, we want to hear from yourselves. So the public consultation process is ongoing through tonight, and we can always contact us with any concerns you may have or any information that you'd like to share. And there's also the statutory consultation as well. So that's it from myself this evening. I'm going to hand you over to Brian Hegarty, who's going to give you an overview just of the community and stakeholder engagement process as well.
Thanks very much, Emma, and good evening, everyone. Thanks very much for attending. We really appreciate it. A quick bit of background on myself. So my name is Brian Hegarty. I'm the Offshore Wind Stakeholder Manager on the Sea Stacks project. I'm a graduate of biological sciences. My specialism was in applied ecology. I've been working in renewables for the last 16 years, largely onshore across Northern Ireland, Scotland, and the Republic of Ireland. Early day site identification, agreeing deals with landowners, essentially getting everything done then in terms of the planning process up to the point of planning approval. I joined ESB's offshore wind team in April last year, and my responsibility is now really everything in terms of stakeholder engagement from both an onshore and offshore perspective. The various activities that I'm involved in, it's interface and liaison with the fishing organisations, the fishers themselves. It's interface with other marine users, shipping, leisure tourism, surfing, aquaculture, Coast Guard. And then it's also outside of the marine aspect, it's interfacing with the onshore communities, the clubs, the organisations, the individuals, the councils. I also look after, from a stakeholder engagement perspective, any of the events or exhibitions for our project. I'll touch on that later on. We attended one earlier this year. Also any advertising, so anything that goes into industry-specific magazines, into a float or into the skipper, or anything in terms of local newspaper ads relative to our virtual consultation rooms, our forestry license consultations. Our project website and any of the associated updates, as well as the project mailbox, that's something I look after as well. And then also the building of the virtual consultation rooms. We had one open for Sea Stacks. I'll touch on that in the next slide. Then externally, we have a consultant fishery liaison officer who assists us in some of our interface with the fishing community. And then last but not least, there's obviously an internal management piece as well. This one is largely around the community benefit funds and how best we can utilise those to the benefit of the communities in which we're hoping to place our projects. The next slide then, it's a quick run through of some of the activities that I've participated in to date relative to our Sea Stacks project, as well as some of the things that that'll be hoping to have coming down the track. The photograph on the screen is one of our meetings with one of the producer organisations. We've also met with Patrick Murphy from the Irish South and West. We've also met with 3 other producer organisations, but we're also very conscious that there are others that we need to meet. There are regional inshore forums and also the national forums. The reason for that is really to introduce our project at a very high level, to get an initial feedback from those organisations, and really to start building up a relationship. Our project, assuming all goes to plan, won't get constructed until probably the late 2020s, and it's important that the fishing community, and indeed all the communities that we deal with, have an opportunity to see the whites of our eyes, to be able to ask any questions that they wish to ask, and for us not to be hiding behind any doors. In terms of direct interaction with the fishing community, with boat owners, with skippers, I've carried out visits to Hoath and Leary, Greystones and Wicklow. Those were just, again, initial visits similar to the meetings with the producer organisations. One of the things I'm particularly conscious of is overburdening the fishing community, or indeed any of the people that we meet. We don't want to burn their time without reason. Fundamentally, the reason why we're out trying to have these conversations is to provide information, and it's to try and avoid speculation or misinformation. And then once we have those initial meetings, it's essential that we try and keep people up to date as our project progresses. Then there has been a degree of interaction with the councils, chief executives of the councils, as well as the elected local councillors from each one of those councils. So far, that has largely been in the form of informing about our projects via email. In the form, it related to this webinar. It is related to our foreshore license consultations. It is related to the virtual consultation room. So just leading on to that, then the Sea Stacks virtual consultation room was open for a period of 6 weeks. It closed on the 6th of June. There will have been advertisements in local papers, but for anyone on the call that did miss that, that will be the first in a series of virtual consultation rooms that we'll be running on the project. Everyone that has been that has requested an invite to the to this webinar this evening will go onto our stakeholder log, and will be informed whenever we have any further phases of the virtual consultation room. So in other activities, it's update to the web page, keeping that live. It has been a presentation to UCD and indeed other universities in relation to ESB's offshore ambitions. That's fundamentally around the scale of the opportunity, to inform people of the scale of the opportunity, but also the numbers and the types of jobs that that we're going to hopefully see the universities have their students coming out with those skills. The image on the images there is from the Skipper Expo, so it attends at events. ESB was only one of 2 offshore wind developers at the Skipper Expo in Limerick earlier this year. It's a very large event, and certainly very beneficial from our perspective. It's from our perspective, it's getting our message out there. Then the last 2 points that I have in this slide is largely around the onshore engagement piece. I'm personally very conscious that that's something that we need to increase our focus on, and in that regard, we have a community liaison officer which will be starting with us on the 8th of August. So in the second half of this year, certainly we intend to ramp up our engagement with those onshore communities. There'll probably be a series of public exhibitions forming part of that, but certainly we'll want to reach out to as many groups and bodies as we possibly can. And then the last point is somewhat related to the previous one. It's talking to the communities around what will actually benefit them. So that's from a community benefit fund perspective, but it's also around if we're going to offer some early day investment, should that be in education? Should it be in research? Should it be in training? And certainly from an ESB perspective, we don't want to tell the communities what's best for them. We want to be led. We want to leave positive legacy from this project. So we will be taking a steer from you, the community local to the project, and certainly we would request openness from you on that front. So then, last slide from myself, and you'll all probably be glad to hear this is the last one before we move into our Q&A. But I thought it was very important that we just touch on what we would see as the key benefits of the project. Liam touched on earlier, the climate change piece, the changes that we're seeing, the changes that we've seen even earlier this week. So a lot of what we're doing, and certainly from a Sea Stacks Offshore Wind perspective, will have very, very significant contribution to ESB's net zero target, but also to Ireland's renewable energy targets. But tied with that as well, it's our over-reliance on imported fossil fuels. In terms of the natural gas that we use on the island, 27% of that comes from the Corrib gas field. That's been operational since 2015, 2016, and probably has about another 15 years of life left in it. So that means 73% of the natural gas that we use is being imported. All of the oil that we use is imported, and 70% of that arrives in the form of petrol and diesel. So we're hugely reliant on imported fossil fuels, and we have an excellent opportunity to address that and to address the security of supply issue which is really in relation to my next point. So the security of supply issue, we have got a wonderful resource. As an island nation, the winds around our coast are a wonderful resource in terms of meeting some of the concerns that we face as an island, but also the concerns that the world has from a global perspective. And just in terms of the scale of the opportunity, one offshore wind turbine in one day will produce enough electricity to meet the demands of 51 Irish homes. So whenever that's scaled up to the size of what we're looking at for Sea Stacks, that's 2,000 homes in a day, or it's 750,000, 750,000 homes on an annual basis. So the scale of the opportunity here, it's important to highlight that aspect. The other aspects then, the community benefit fund, which will be delivered as part of the project as well, that will probably generate, now it obviously depends on how well the site performs, it depends on how many turbines we can actually get erected. That will probably generate somewhere in the region of 5 to 6 million per annum to be spent on local community projects. And for that one, as was touched on very briefly in the previous slide, it's essential that we have local buy-in to advise as to what's best for your own communities. We want to leave a lasting legacy. It's very, very important to us that we leave a lasting legacy, and that's after the project is gone. If we can put in facilities, new infrastructure, that's something that we see as very, very important in terms of our projects. So with regard to the community benefit fund, it's not the wad of cash that's in the top right of the slide. It's a sitting around the table to try and agree what's best, and working through any issues. And I've no doubt that there will be there'll be significant variances of opinion, but it's working through that aspect. And then it's hopefully that we'll see something like the headlines as there is in the bottom of the slide. Grimsby was a port town which was failing. It was a large steel industry town, a lot of car manufacturing, but that died to death. But off the back of renewable energy, offshore wind development, that has seen a very significant resurgence. And then just associated with that, I guess, is the very last point. It's the jobs and local investment piece. So the Carbon Trust prepared a report in March 2020. At that stage, Ireland was looking at a 3.5 gigawatt target by 2030. That's now 5 gigawatts. But at 3.5 gigawatts, the expectation was that there would be 2,500 local jobs in planning, development, and construction, and another 700 long-term jobs during the operational life. So those are big numbers, and they're the kind of jobs that can change local communities where people are moving to the larger cities. This should certainly be an opportunity to try and revitalize, to try and keep young people here, so that whenever they go off to their universities or wherever it might be, that they actually return, because there are further opportunities for them. The last piece then is just a snippet from the newspaper relative to ESB's jobs. So as part of our target towards the 1,000, as part of our net zero strategy, we committed at the end of May this year to recruit 1,000 people over the next 3 years, and that's across all fields. So it's not just environmental, it's not just civil engineering, it's IT, it's HR, and certainly I would encourage anyone that has an interest to go to the Sea Stacks Offshore Wind website, and there'll be contact us details included in there. Thanks very much, Connor. That's back to you in terms of the questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Brian, and thanks to all the speakers. So that concludes the presentations part of the webinar, and we'll now move to the Q&A portion. So just a reminder that to submit questions for the webinar, we're using the Menti platform. So the website and the code details are shown on the screen there. So if you wish to submit any questions, go to the Menti website and input that 8-digit code. So Brian, while I have you there, I just might pose the first question to you. Where do I go to provide my feedback on this project?
the first port of call, Connor, I would advise for everybody is the project webpage itself. You know, that's where we'll have any of the updates. It's where we'll have information relative to any of our consultations, any of our virtual consultation rooms. And indeed, if someone wants, you know, if they want to put in a call, they want to set up a face-to-face meeting, or indeed if there's a specific query that's not on my own field, it's not stakeholder related, but it's in relation to grid or whatever, you know, certainly I can direct that, and the team member will go back. So in the first instance, I would say the contact us section of our project webpage. Then outside of that, Connor, you know, the government itself will be running its own public consultation processes, just like it is at the moment relative to the foreshore license consultation. So those while they can be accessed via government web pages, we'll also be pointing to those via the latest news section on our project website as well. So that's probably where I would direct people in the first instance.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Brian. For the next question, I might go to Ailish. There's just a couple of questions on some abbreviations. So first up, what is a TSO standard?
Okay, apologies for using abbreviations. A TSO standard, so the TSO is a transmission system operator, so that is EirGrid. So when I was talking about TSO standards, I was talking about the 220 kV system. So following government decision in May 2021, EirGrid will own the high voltage assets all the way to the offshore substation. So therefore, developers like ourselves have to build these assets in accordance with EirGrid's technical standards. So EirGrid are actually developing those offshore technical standards in conjunction with industry and conjunction with international review of what's done in the EU as well. So those standards are currently being developed for offshore.
Okay, thanks for that. That's very clear. And then another abbreviation, the CCGT abbreviation. Can you explain what that stands for?
Okay, so CCGT is combined cycle gas turbine. So this is the type of plant that we have in the Poolbeg and Ringsend facilities. So effectively, it's an efficient gas plant that uses both gas and a steam turbine to generate electricity.
Okay, great. Thanks, Ailish.
Thanks, Connor.
For the next question, I might go to Emma on this one. Will I be able to see the wind farm from the coast?
Thanks, Connor. Yeah, well, I suppose visual impacts really is one of the key considerations really in designing and locating of any offshore wind farm. And so the layouts of any offshore wind farm will need to take into consideration views, and particularly for this project along the east coast. And it may be possible to see the offshore wind farm from certain points. And I suppose the really key thing about the iterative design process and the environmental impact assessment process is trying to minimize any visual impact that may happen. So the design process needs to take consideration of that. And I suppose there's a number of other factors as well that needs to be considered in siting and designing a wind farm. And from the environmental side, which everything from marine habitats to ornithology to fishing to shipping to amenity users and sailors. So that all has to be considered in terms of siting and designing a wind farm, as well as the landscape and visuals. So for the next stage of the project, when we appoint an EIA consultant as part of that, we'll be appointing a specialist and highly experienced landscape, seascape and visual specialist who will be taking that assessment for us. So they go out and they do field work and desktop assessments, and they feed that information back to us so that we can, I suppose, incorporate any findings that they may have and mitigate any design issues that there may be and any sensitivities in terms of views and landscapes. I suppose just that environmental really is only one side of the house in terms of siting an offshore wind farm. And David, I might hand it over to yourself. You might be able to give maybe just a brief overview on the technical perspective on what informs the layout of an offshore wind farm. That's all right.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Emma. Yeah. So in terms of ultimately the layout of the wind farm, there's in addition to what Emma mentioned, there's a number of technical aspects which we'd consider when we're putting the final layout together. But A few of them, as an example, would be the wind resource and managing internal and external kind of wind turbulence effects or wake impact effects within the wind farm. So the denser, the closer we site the turbines together, the more of this turbulent effect we get. So there's a drive to kind of push the turbines further away from each other to minimize that impact within the wind farm. There's also the size of commercially available turbines in the latter part of this decade will influence the layout and how the project will look from the coast. At the moment, we'd expect that turbines by the late 2020s will be somewhere in the region of 250 meter rotor diameter with an air gap to the water level. So you're looking at maybe 280 meters tip height, or in and around that part. But it's a continually evolving part of the industry. The other thing that might influence the layout is some of the surveys we spoke about earlier, where we'll get information around the site characteristics. There may be some parts of the site after we do those surveys that we uncover are challenging to put foundations in. So there may be parts of the site we'd need to avoid from an engineering perspective. And then there's other things around proximity to possibly other projects in the area, as we're aware that there's other projects proposed in the area too. So yeah, those will be kind of the main technical ones, which would also be considered in combination with some of the items that Emma mentioned.
Okay, thanks, David, and thanks, Emma. It's a very comprehensive answer from an environmental and a technical perspective. David, while I have you there, there's something that you touched on there that we have a question in relation to on the geotechnical surveys. So when are the geotechnical surveys scheduled for?
Yeah, so as noted on the call, we're looking at the geophysical surveys either this year or next year. And that's a prerequisite to undertaking geotechnical surveys, because we want to understand where we want to basically map features on the seabed that either we want to investigate or we want to stay away from. So for example, there may be shipwrecks on the site that we don't know about today. So before we go and doing intrusive boreholes we want to make sure we're not going through an area with possible marine archaeology that's sensitive. So the geotechnical surveys are likely to be at the earliest in 2023, probably in the summer season, and if failing that, later in 2023 Q4 or else into 2024.
Okay, thanks, David. I think for the next question, I might come back to Emma again. So will the future wind farm impact on birds, and how will you ensure or minimize, make sure there's no impact?
Yeah, I suppose as well as the landscape and visual that I spoke about, ornithology, is a really important consideration that we need to take on board for the designing of the wind farm. We know the Irish Sea, and particularly the East Coast, it hosts so many varieties of bird species, and we're lucky to have breeding and wintering and migrating and coastal bird species, just off Dublin and along the East Coast. In terms of impact, there is a potential to impact at various stages of a project, really, from temporary disturbance during the construction phase through to operational displacement or collision risk, when the wind farm is in operation. So I suppose that's why we're going out and gathering all this baseline information and kicking off those surveys very early, and employing experts in their field, and keeping abreast of what's going on in terms of other various national and global studies as well. So the surveys that we are undertaking gives us at least 2 years of data that we'll be able to use in terms of estimating the abundance and distribution of different species. And that understanding really is critical to designing the project and informing the layout of the turbine array. And then it allows us to put in place suitable mitigation then that should mitigate and help reduce the impact. So it's a lot of the ornithological assessments. Really, there's a lot of new and up and coming data becoming and information becoming available, through on a regular basis, really. And we'll be connecting with National Parks and Wildlife and Birdwatch Ireland to discuss findings from our surveys and chat to them about, additional data requirements that we could take on board, and to discuss really any approach in terms of how we carry out our impact assessments, and the EIA and the AA process as well. So hopefully that answers the question, Connor, if that's...
Okay, no, that's great. Thanks for that, Emma. David, I've a couple of other questions that I might give to you. So there's a lot of interest in some of the technical aspects of the project.
Sure.
So first up is around the project's operational lifetime that you mentioned, a 25-year scope. Why can't that be longer?
Yeah, so the 25-year operational life, so that would be a typical lifetime for an offshore wind farm. But there's a number of aspects. So as part of the operational phase of the project, we will be looking to obviously maintain the good working order of the offshore facilities to maintain and to carry on the operational life as long as possible. So that's why I was saying it would be 25 to 30 years. Where possible and where it's economic and where it's safe to do so, ESB will continue the operational aspects of the project. But one thing that has to be remembered is the offshore environment is an aggressive environment, and wave loading and the salinity is effectively will bring fatigue and corrosion to some key aspects of the project, and at some stage it'll cease to be economic to continue replacing parts, and at that stage projects generally decommission and either look to repower or fully decommission, depending on the consents associated with the project. So 25 years would be the base case, and we'd look to basically extend it on a kind of yearly basis after that, to as long as the facility is working as planned.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I think that's clear. So 25 is kind of an industry standard, but it could potentially be longer.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, and then maybe another question for you, David. Is Dublin Port the preferred port to be used for this project, or will there be space to hold the various construction material components?
Sure. So it's worth saying that the project will likely need ports for both the O&M phase and the construction marshalling stage. It's not necessarily going to be the case that there'll be the same port will be used for both. In either case at the moment, we haven't made any final decisions around either the O&M port or the construction marshalling port. Members of our team are engaging with ports along the East Coast to basically look at ports that are suitable for the project requirements. So the construction marshalling port requires significant laydown area for components such as the foundations and wind turbines. It requires a long quayside for these very large vessels. It possibly requires the ability to use jack-up vessels, which push up off the seabed to pick up components. And it obviously needs area that doesn't disrupt the routine operations of a port. So at this stage, we haven't got any preferred ports in mind. We're talking to many ports, and if there's anybody on the call who wants to reach out and engage with us around that particular topic for either O&M or construction marshalling, we're more than happy to have any meetings. So feel free to reach out via the website. But yeah, hopefully that's answered the question.
Yeah, no, I think that's clear. Thanks, David. So I'm just conscious of time here. So there's lots of questions coming in here, which is great. And we probably won't have time to get to all of them. So Liam, to finish up with, I might give you a nice easy one. Will the project lead to a reduction in my electricity bill?
Yeah. Thanks, Connor. Yeah, great question. I guess, look, wind power puts downward pressure on electricity prices as it's the cheapest form of new generation. So offshore wind is a higher capacity factor than onshore wind. So meaning with the higher wind speeds you see offshore, the turbines are basically more productive. And it's also a predictable source of power, as accurate weather forecasting allows the system operator to manage that output. I think in recent years as well, we've seen the cost of production from offshore wind fall dramatically right across the UK and right across Europe and the UK. And this has been driven by new technology, economies of scale, and efficient supply chains. I think we have the opportunity to benefit from those cost reductions in Ireland. The current spike that we've all seen in electricity prices in the last 6 to 9 months has been driven by factors largely beyond our control, really, because we're so dependent on gas imports. And the more wind then that we produce from projects like Sea Stacks, the greater the amount of gas generation we can take off the system. This will reduce the Irish consumers' reliance on gas as a primary fuel and will in turn lower the exposure of the Irish electricity consumer to ongoing high prices from imported fossil fuels. And ultimately then, this will help to lower our electricity bills. So I hope that answers the question, Connor.
Yeah, thanks, Liam. Very, very comprehensive answer. So thanks to Liam and thanks to everyone on the panel for going through the Q&A. Some really useful information there. Unfortunately, we didn't have time to get through all the questions, but we do intend to answer everything that's come in. So we'll be posting answers to all of those questions in due course up on the project website, along with the recording of this evening's webinar. So at this point, I think I'd like to bring the webinar to a close. Once again, to thank everyone for your interest in the project, and thanks for taking the time to join this evening. There will be future public exhibitions and in-person events. So as Brian mentioned, you'll be contacted, and we will send out details in advance of any of these to make sure that we can engage with people as much as possible as the project develops. So at that point, I think we can close, and goodbye and take care.